Talaga? Kaya lang. Hello. Today, I'm actually all by myself in this live stream. Well, I'm not completely alone. At the very least, I am completely alone in this living room. Yeah, I'm not lying. You can see nobody there. Yep, no one is in. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So today. So, by the way, I was thinking about making a series, a very short-lived series on the Bryan Extra channel that would be called 29 on 29. It's a series where I just make very long or just videos on this camera 29 times, where I will upload that on the 29th of February 29 times. So I don't know if that would be possible, or if it is possible, it would be achievable, because there's only 24 hours in a given day, and I would have to post 29 videos, so that would be 12 videos on all the hours, and on the 30-minute mark of every single hour, another 12 videos, and then at 10:15, 11:15, 12:15, 1:15, and 2:15, I would be posting the remaining 5 videos. So I don't know if that is actually achievable. So yeah. What do you think? Because I think that would be a banger of a series. It would actually be terrible, but they would be high quality, because the minimum frame rate of this video, of this camera, is 1080p. So I'm very safe in that matter. It's just what the contents of the video that I'm actually worried about. So, yeah. Anyways, let's do something. You should. Right, okay. There we go. Right. I actually don't know what to do. Let's go spell check. Let's try test out our spelling. I don't know why this website has a captcha. Okay. Hold on. let's play the video.
Frock, a noun meaning an outer garment worn. Default, a noun meaning failure to do something required by due. Splurge, a noun meaning an ostentatious effort. Recoup, a verb meaning to get an equivalent for. Chaotic, an adjective meaning marked by chaos.
Alright. Okay, let's go to the next round. Level 2 medium.
Lackadaisical, an adjective meaning lacking life, spirit, or zest. Languid. Irregular originates from lackaday with the suffix -ical added. Lackadaisical, an adjective meaning lacking life, spirit, or zest. Languid. Irregular Requisition, a noun meaning the act of formally requiring or calling. Celsius, an adjective meaning relating to, conforming to, or having the international thermometric scale on which the interval between the triple point of water and the boiling point of water is divided into 99.99 degrees, with 0.01 degrees representing the triple point and 100 degree the boiling point. Also, centigrade, abbreviation C, Celsius, an adjective meaning. Sentries, a noun meaning guard, watch, especially a soldier standing
sentries.
guard at a point of passage, such as a gate. Watchtower.
There we go.
Misconstrue, a verb meaning to interpret, something such as a statement or
Right, let's go hard.
tomography, a noun meaning a method of producing a three-dimensional image of the internal.
Right, okay.
Tarpaulin, a noun meaning a piece of material used especially for
tarpaulin.
protecting exposed.
It's tarpaulin, not tarpaulin, or tarpaulin. It's tarpaulin.
Gnomon, a noun meaning an object that by the position or length of its shadow serves as an indicator especially of the hour of the day, such as. Gnomon comes from Greek for one who knows or examines, and Latin for sundial pointer. Gnomon, a noun meaning an object that by the position. Covenant, a noun meaning a usually formal, solemn, and binding agreement.
I put double N.
Nereid, a noun meaning any of a family, Nereidae, of chiefly marine polychaete worms, especially any of a genus, Nereus, of usually large, often greenish worms. Nereidae originates from New Latin Nereus, which is derived from Latin nereid. Nereid, a noun meaning any of a family, Nereidae.
Let's go see results. Alright, so this is my spell check progress. Let's see, Frock, Default, Splurge, Recoup, and Chaotic. Oh, lackadaisical, like, alright, okay. Requisitions, injuries, Pneuman, it's a GN. Nereid. Shouldn't be spelled Nereid or Nereid. It should be pronounced. Man, wow. Okay. I am pretty bad at spelling, but that's okay. It's maybe forgivable a bit. It's a bit forgivable because I'm actually not an American. Yeah. There's pretty big evidence here. Like just from this house alone. Look at this is not what 3:29 p.m. looks like in the United States. Look, it's so bright outside. It seems like we're always on a heat wave, but we're just used to it because, yeah, it's like 3:30 p.m. now, and just here. I think this is a better angle, to watch the videos or do some things. Let's just go to YouTube. I don't know. Don't know what to watch. We will binge watch some Nile Red. That could be possible. The Philippines becomes Southeast Asia's fastest growing economy. Now that is a big positive. Umangat sa kahirapan ng Pilipinas! Yeah! Anyways.
About 2 years ago, I became convinced that there was a way to turn cotton balls into edible and hopefully tasty cotton candy. At first, this idea seemed a bit ridiculous.
Try restarting your device. What?
But I knew that it should have been possible. This is because cotton, even though it doesn't seem like it at all, is technically entirely
there are audio tracks here? Oh wow. Since when did he put audio tracks in videos? Okay. Okay, now Red.
entirely sugar. The only problem is that all this sugar, or more specifically glucose, is trapped in something called cellulose. As cellulose, it acts like a completely different material, and we can use it to make things like cotton balls and clothing. At its core, though, it's all just sugar. So, what I dreamed of doing was breaking down cotton balls back into sugar and then turning them into candy. I didn't just want to make any candy, though, and I specifically wanted to make cotton candy. I wanted to make literal cotton candy.
Boy, this is what happens to my laptop whenever I make a video. I'm really sorry. Not really make, actually, watch a video.
About 2 years ago, I became convinced that there was a way to turn cotton balls into edible and hopefully tasty cotton candy. At first, this idea seemed a bit ridiculous, but I knew that it should have been possible. This is because cotton, even though it doesn't seem like it at all, is technically entirely sugar. The only problem is that all this sugar, or more specifically glucose, is trapped in something called cellulose. As cellulose, it acts like a completely different material, and we can use it to make things like cotton balls and clothing. At its core, though, it's all just sugar. So, what I dreamed of doing was breaking down cotton balls back into sugar and then turning them into candy. I didn't just want to make any candy, though, and I specifically wanted to make cotton candy. I wanted to make literal cotton candy. To get started, the first thing that I had to do was figure out how to even do it. I had to come up with a way to break down the cellulose back into sugar, and my first idea was to use an enzyme. This was because I had already used an enzyme for another project where I turned toilet paper into drinkable alcohol, and it had worked really well. For that one, I used an enzyme called cellulase, and I was able to break down the toilet paper, which is also entirely cellulose. This gave me a solution of sugar, which I fermented to alcohol using yeast, and then I distilled it to make my toilet paper moonshine. The whole process ended up being surprisingly efficient, and I figured it was the best place to start. The only issue was that the enzyme I'd used wasn't pure, and it was mixed with maltodextrin and cornstarch. Both of these were sugars, but they weren't fermentable by yeast, so none of it turned into alcohol, and they didn't at all interfere with that project. However, for this one, I couldn't have any extra sugar floating around. It would be almost impossible to separate it from the sugar that I made, and it would just be a huge mess. I had to find somewhere to buy the pure enzyme, and the easiest and cheapest source seemed to be Alibaba. It was pretty easy to go on, find a listing, and order the enzyme, but actually getting what I wanted turned out to be a huge pain. The first and biggest problem was that I never knew if it was actually going to be sugar-free. I always asked, and they would confirm that it was, but it never seemed fully believable. Also, the Canadian government kept seizing the packages and holding them for months. This one, by far, had to be the worst one that I got. Customs had apparently torn it open and repackaged it by just throwing it into a loose plastic bag. It was also brown, which immediately told me that it wasn't very pure, and I could tell there was sugar in it because it was sticky when I touched it. It took months, but I eventually got one that seemed decent, and it of course arrived as ginseng extract. It was an off-white, but still pure powder, and it didn't seem to have any fillers or sugars. When I tried it on the cotton, though, it just didn't work very well. I think the enzyme itself was good quality, and the cotton was just really stubborn. I knew that it would be a bit harder to break down than toilet paper, but I didn't expect it to be as bad as it was. I was never really able to do it, and after trying for a while, I knew that it would be a bit harder to break down than
Even pre-treating it with acid or base didn't seem to work. I think it needs to be pulverized and turned into a powder, which can be very hard to do.
Toilet paper, but I didn't expect it to be as bad as it was. I was never really able to do it, and after trying for a while, I basically gave up. About a year later, though, I got really inspired for some reason, and I decided to attempt this project again. I read every single book, article, or paper that I could find, and I slowly put something together. My biggest challenge was that I didn't want to have to use any specialized equipment or weird chemicals, and I wanted it to be as simple as possible. I also ideally wanted the sugar that I made to taste good, or at the very least, not poison me. After about a week, I ended up coming up with something that I thought could work. Instead of using enzyme to break down the cotton, I would just use acid, and the process seemed to be surprisingly simple. So I decided to just jump right into it, and I picked up an entire bag of cotton balls. I went with the large ones, just because I felt like it, and it looked like a lot, but it was only about 77 grams. Now the next main ingredient that I needed was some 98% concentrated sulfuric acid. For all this cotton, I calculated that I needed 230 grams of it, and I poured it directly onto 70 grams of ice. This almost immediately caused most of the ice to melt, and when it was all added, I turned on the stirring. What I was doing here was just diluting the sulfuric acid and bringing the concentration down from 98% to 75%. I also used ice to do this because it generated a lot of heat, and the whole solution was now probably around 60 C or 140 Fahrenheit. If I'd used regular water instead of ice, it probably would have violently boiled and splashed, which wouldn't have been ideal. But anyway, when it looked like it was all mixed, I turned off the stirring, and I let it cool down to room temperature. About 30 minutes later, it was good to go, and I pulled out the stir bar. It was now time to add the cotton, and I started with just one ball. I then poked it around a bit, and it almost immediately started falling apart. In general, cotton's usually pretty tough, and I thought that it was interesting to see it just disintegrate. It only took a minute for it to become a little gooey blob, and I felt that I was ready to add the rest. So, I carefully loaded in a small handful, and it looked like it was barely gonna fit. At first, this was a bit concerning, because this was only a small fraction of what I had to add. With just a bit of poking around and stirring though, it slowly disappeared into the acid.
Ewy and the gooey.
I then continued adding the rest of the cotton, and I was honestly a bit worried that it wasn't going to be able to eat the whole bag. Now, as far as I know, there was no major reaction going on here, and the cotton was just getting dissolved. I wasn't able to find much info about it, but it seems like the sulfuric acid was probably just interacting with the cellulose. It was forming a complex around their hydroxyl groups, which normally help the fibers stay tightly packed together. This was causing them to separate and fall apart and dissolve into the acid. It really didn't seem like it was going to work, but I was able to fit the whole bag. Now at this point, things were looking pretty good, but to fully dissolve the cotton, I had to warm it up a bit. So I dropped it into a hot water bath at 50°C, and I let it sit there for 30 minutes. When it was done, it looked like all the cotton had disappeared, and I pulled it out of the bath. I then poured it into 456 milliliters of boiling hot water. This diluted the acid even more, and it brought it down from the 75% that I had before to 27%. I then washed out the beaker with a bit of water to make sure that I transferred everything, and I added a thermometer. I now had to keep this at 85°C, and even though it didn't look like much was happening, it was the most important step. In the other one, the cotton had just been dissolved, but here, it was actually getting chopped up. The long cellulose fibers were being attacked by the acid and water, and they were breaking the bonds between the sugar units. This type of reaction is called a hydrolysis reaction, and they were breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces. I had to keep it running like this for 2 hours, and in that time, it should fully break down into glucose. When it was done, it looked about the same, and I poured all of this into an even larger beaker. This one was surrounded with ice to help cool things down, but it was still going to take a while. So, in the meantime, I prepared something else that I needed. I went and got some of my food-grade calcium carbonate, which is basically just chalk. I would be using this to neutralize all the sulfuric acid, but I couldn't just throw it in as a powder. I had to make it into a slurry, and based on my calculations, I needed about 245 grams. So I measured that out and added 125 mils of water. I then stirred it around, and after a few minutes, it was good to go. When everything eventually cooled down to around room temperature, I started adding the goopy chalk.
Goopy chalk.
It reacted almost immediately with the sulfuric acid, and it was releasing a lot of CO2 gas. This was all being generated as the acid was being neutralized, and the acid itself was turning into calcium sulfate. The only problem was that I had to add the chalk in small amounts, or else it would bubble out of the beaker. This was a very slow process, and it was going okay, until it eventually got a bit too thick. This happened because the calcium sulfate was practically insoluble in water, and it was all separating out. So to fix this, I occasionally added some extra water to loosen things up, and it seemed to help. I also added some more water to the chalk, and I slowly added the rest of it. At some point, it really started looking way too much like iced coffee, and it was a bit scary how much I wanted to taste it. That would have been a horrible idea though, and it would have tasted absolutely awful. But anyway, I was eventually done adding the chalk, and when I tested the pH, it told me that it was roughly neutral. What I had now was hopefully a mixture of calcium sulfate and dirty sugar water, and the next step was to filter it. I poured in as much as I could into the filter, but it wasn't even close to fitting everything. I was only able to add what looked like half of it, and I was gonna have to do this in 2 batches. After loading up as much as I could, I turned on the vacuum, and I started pulling out the water. This was all being drained into a flask below the filter, and I was getting some nice and clear, dark liquid. When the stuff in the filter looked dry, I added some water. I then mixed it around, and I was doing this to wash out any sugar that might have been stuck in the calcium sulfate. This was then all pulled through, and I washed it a second time. Now I had to deal with the other half of the stuff, so I washed the filter, and I added everything that was left in the beaker. It was all just barely able to fit, and I turned on the vacuum. Just like before, I pulled it all through, and I washed it twice with some water. In the flask below, I was left with a bunch of dark liquid. This was all hopefully some dirty sugar water, but up until now, I had no idea if I had actually made any sugar. To figure this out though, it was actually pretty easy, and I just had to use a glucose test strip. This is normally used to check for sugar in pee, and I was a bit worried that it would tell me that there was nothing. However, it actually gave me some really good results. It told me that there was for sure glucose in there, and that there was probably a decent amount. The only problem was that it was still full of impurities, side products, and leftover acid, and what I had to do next was try and clean it up a bit. To do this, I figured the easiest way was to use something called a mixed ion exchange resin. At first, this might sound a bit fancy, and it kind of is, but it's actually super simple to use. It's also commonly used to purify aquarium water, so it's pretty cheap and quite easy to buy. I got all my resin from Amazon, and all I did was put it in this plastic tube. Now to clean the dirty sugar solution, I just had to pour it through. As it passed over the resin, it pulled out anything that was charged, and this included things like acid and salts. The sugar itself, though, was a neutral molecule, and it shouldn't have been affected by it. It even got rid of some of the color, and after just one run, it was looking a lot lighter. I then swapped out the beaker for another container, and I passed it all through again. I was doing this just to really make sure that I pulled out as much junk as possible. When it was done, I washed the resin with some extra water, and at this point, it should have been relatively pure. Besides the obvious orange color, there should have been practically no salts or acid. However, the main issue now was that there was still way too much water, and I had to get rid of most of it. So, after pouring it all into this large dish, I threw it into a food dehydrator. This is normally meant for things like peppers or fruit, and it's basically just a warm box with a fan. I then ran it until I felt that it was low enough, which ended up taking about 35 hours. After that, I took it out, and I poured it all into a beaker. It was just slightly over 400 mils, and now that it was more concentrated, it was a bit darker. It was also slightly acidic, and it had a bit of a weird smell. This unfortunately meant that I had to go back to the ion exchange resin. This time though, I did it in a different tube that I made from a water bottle. This one had a valve at the bottom that I could close, so everything wouldn't pass through right away. I also included a bunch of activated charcoal along with the resin, which I was hoping would help with the smell and color. After everything was added, I stirred it around, and then I let it sit there. I wasn't sure how long I had to leave it, and based on almost nothing, I decided that 5 hours was probably good. Over that time, I just randomly stirred it every so often, and it did get noticeably lighter. When it hit the 5-hour mark, I opened the valve, and I drained everything out. I washed everything with a bit of extra water, and it was now hopefully cleaner. The only thing that I didn't like was that it looked a bit cloudy. To fix this, I tried pouring it through some cotton and sea light, but I don't think that did much of anything. In any case, what I had now was still way better, and it no longer had a weird smell. It basically just smelled like water, and it also wasn't acidic. The only issue was that there was still way too much water, so I put it back into the dehydrator. I then ran it until it looked like it was almost all gone. When I felt that it was done, I pulled it out, and I put it into an even smaller container. This one was made of silicone, and if I had made any sugar, I was hoping that it wouldn't stick to it. After that, I put it back in, and I ran it until it looked like the volume stayed constant. When it eventually looked like it was done, I took it out. I was really hoping to see some nice and crunchy sugar, but that of course wasn't the case. Only this part in the corner, kind of looked like it was solid. I thought that maybe it was just having a hard time crystallizing, so I covered it, and I put it in the freezer for a couple days. When I took it out, I thought that it was looking really promising. However, it wasn't. It was all goopy, and honestly a bit disappointing, but I was still kind of happy. Even though it wasn't nice and crunchy, the texture more or less confirmed that it was sugar. There weren't very many other things that I could have made here that would be sticky and gooey like this. I wasn't exactly sure why it wasn't completely solid, but I figured it was probably because I just didn't dry it enough. There was still some water in there, making it all sticky, and unfortunately, I had to get it out. If I tried putting this into a cotton candy machine, it would be an absolute mess. To dry it, I put together this little setup, which is just an upside-down tray on a hot plate with a baking sheet on top. I then scraped off all the sugar, which totally stuck to the silicone, and I transferred it all here. I slowly turned up the heating, and I brought it up to just above 100°C to boil off the water. I let it bubble like this for a while, and after several minutes, it was probably pretty dry. I still wasn't done though, because even with it dry, I knew that it still wouldn't work to make cotton candy. This was because I had already done a few basic tests using pure glucose, and it had completely failed. I had no idea why, but it only seemed to work when the glucose was partially caramelized. So, I slowly raised the temperature of the hot plate, and I brought it up to 185°C. Under this high heat, the sugar was hopefully caramelizing, which actually meant that it was repolymerizing. This was basically the exact opposite of what I did to make the sugar, and I was rebuilding them back into slightly longer chains. It would still be edible though, and it would never go back to being like cotton. My only issue here was that I had no idea how long I had to heat it for, and I was also really afraid of burning it. I ended up letting it go until I felt that it looked good, which took about an hour. I then pulled it off the hot plate, and I waited for it to cool down to room temperature. After half an hour, it looked exactly the same, and for a second, I thought that it was still all goopy. When I poked at it though, it was completely solid, and it also looked and felt like candy. I was pretty happy with how it had turned out, and it was a lot more sugar than I needed. It was also a lot more than I ever expected to get, especially after my failures with the enzyme. However, the yield was technically kind of crappy, and I only got about 20 grams. In theory, I probably should have gotten at least 50. This meant that I had lost a lot along the way, and I honestly have no idea where it went. I'm thinking that a lot of it might have gotten trapped in the exchange resin or in all the calcium sulfate. Or maybe, in general, the process just wasn't super efficient. Either way, I never expected this process to be amazing, and 20 grams was more than enough. I was also honestly still kind of amazed that I had even managed to get any sugar at all. Even though I had done this all myself, I still thought that it was hard to believe that this used to be a bag of cotton balls. One thing though, was that I still wasn't 100% sure that this was sugar. I mean, I had tested it with a glucose strip, but I felt that there was only one way to fully confirm it. Up until now, I had completely resisted tasting it, and I was really anxious to try it. If there was anything else in there, it would probably taste really bad or sour, and I was honestly kind of expecting that to happen.
In general, it's a bad idea to taste anything.
Okay, so I guess I'll just... to happen.
What's that? In general, it's a bad idea to taste anything that is made in a lab. I am confident that what I made is safe, but I am still taking a risk.
Okay, so I guess I'll just taste one of the little pieces. tastes pretty good. It's just caramelized sugar. That's it. That's my whole review. Done. Okay, so it was actually a lot better than I expected, and it didn't even have a hint of a weird flavor. But anyway, I guess it was now time to try and turn it into cotton candy. To do this, I figured that all I needed was a cotton candy machine, and I bought one from Amazon. Now in theory, based on the instructions, all I had to do was wait for it to heat up and drop in my sugar. So I waited for about 5 or 10 minutes, and I nervously took out my precious little pieces. I then dropped some in, and I turned on the spinner. I was really hoping to see some nice puffs of cotton candy, but that didn't happen. All it did was shoot out a sad brown liquid. When I saw this, I was honestly pretty disappointed, and I wasn't sure why it failed.
It just shot it all out. It just shot it out as liquid sugar.
Based on my small tests, I was really expecting it to just work. But then again, I'm not some sort of cotton candy master.
Cut. It didn't work. That's what I feared.
I ended up trying it a few more times, and it just never seemed to work. At first, I had no idea why it was failing like this, but I started thinking that the melting point of my candy was just too low. If that were the case, it might just be having a hard time freezing as it flew through the air. This machine was designed for table sugar, or sucrose, which melts at 186 C, but glucose melts around 146 C, and my sugar was probably even lower. I was hoping that this would have been fixed by caramelizing it, but I guess I didn't caramelize it enough.
I think it just has to be more caramelized.
So, I scraped off all the sugar from my sad and failed attempts, and I put it back onto the silicone baking sheet. I then heated it up again to about 200 C. I had no idea how long I had to cook it for, and again, I was a bit afraid of burning it. Over 20 minutes, it darkened a bit more, and when I eventually felt that it was good, I took it off the heat. I then let it cool down like before, and I broke it into a bunch of smaller pieces. Okay, so I was now ready to try again, and I was kind of expecting the same results. In theory, the caramelization should have fixed things, but I was a bit scared because if it didn't, I was kind of out of ideas. There was only one way to find out though, and I dropped some pieces into the machine. I then turned it on, and now I just had to wait. In the meantime, I got ready by climbing up on my little ladder. It was a little awkward, but I found that reaching over the camera was the only decent way to film this. I was half expecting it to almost immediately just shoot out as goo again, but that didn't seem to be happening. In fact, it didn't seem to be doing much of anything.
It's taking a lot longer.
I kept waiting, and I was a bit worried that it would just burn or something, but then there was suddenly a bunch of nice fluff. I then quickly used the stick, and I tried collecting it, and it was actually working. The first thing that I noticed, though, was that it looked a lot thicker than regular cotton candy. I mean, it was all yellow, and the machine sounded like it was dying, but it was still pretty exciting. When it eventually looked like it wasn't making anymore, I turned off the machine.
Oh my god.
Okay, so apparently it had worked, and even though it was probably the saddest and most pathetic cotton candy I'd ever seen, I was still really happy with it. I also really wanted to know how it tasted.
It tastes like regular cotton candy, just a lot more burnt. It's not bad, but it's also not good.
The only major issue with it besides looking and tasting like industrial grade cotton candy, was that it didn't last very long. Even though it was able to solidify, it seemed like it wanted to melt. In just a few minutes, it had shrank quite a bit, and it had gotten a lot harder.
All the work, all of my work to get this.
Before it completely died, though, I broke off a piece of it, and I compared it to a cotton ball. In my opinion, they were shockingly similar, and the cotton candy kind of just looked like a really used and dirty one. But anyway, in the end, I guess I was successful at turning cotton balls into cotton candy. I mean, it wasn't the most efficient transformation, and the quality wasn't exactly the best, but it was still a lot better than I expected, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. For now, though, I think I'm done messing around with sugar, and I'm gonna focus on some other projects, like turning plastic gloves into hot sauce. Okay, so now is when I would normally have a sponsorship, but I've decided not to have one for this video. Instead, I want to take the time to announce that I'm finally selling t-shirts again. The first shirt is the original design that I sold years ago, and there have been a lot of people wondering where it went. The other one is a new design, and personally, I like how it's nice and discreet. Right now, these shirts will only be available for 2 weeks, and I'm not sure if or when they'll be available again. So, if you want to pick one up, or just support the channel, there's a link in the description. My goal in general with this is to be more self-sustaining and to not rely on sponsorships anymore, but I guess I'll have to see how this goes. As usual, a big thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon. Everyone who supports me can see all my new videos at least 24 hours before I post them to YouTube. You'll also get access to all the older videos that I had to take down, and if you support me with $5 or more, you'll get your name at the end like you see here.
Here it is. Toilet paper moonshine. Making or distilling alcohol.
So for this video, I'm...
Hold on. Just let this load. There we go. Making or distilling alcohol can be illegal without the proper permits or licenses. Please don't try to recreate what I do.
So for this video, I'm going to be doing exactly what the title says, and I'm going to be turning toilet paper into drinkable alcohol. I don't know exactly where this idea came from, but about 6 months ago, I became convinced that this conversion was possible. This is because toilet paper, and well, pretty much all paper, I don't know exactly where this idea came from, but about 6 months ago, I became convinced that this conversion was possible. This is because toilet paper, and well, pretty much all paper, is made almost entirely of cellulose. Cellulose naturally occurs in almost all plants, and we use it to make everything from cotton clothing to paper or cardboard. What I've always found interesting though, is that at the core of it, it's just a chain of simple glucose sugar molecules. Sugar is something that we usually associate with food, but in cellulose, the glucose units have been strung together in a very specific way, which gives it completely different properties. This has always blown my mind because it means that our clothing and almost all paper is basically made out of sugar, and wood is also about 50% cellulose, so a lot of our houses are also kind of made out of sugar. For the most part though, cellulose is very resistant to degradation and the glucose is mostly inaccessible. However, the fact that some animals and microbes have developed ways to break it back down into glucose told me that there had to be a way that I could do it. Based on this, my dream was to start with a cellulose source like toilet paper and then somehow chop it up to make a solution of glucose. Into that, I could then throw in some brewer's yeast to turn it into alcohol, and then I could distill it to make some weird toilet paper moonshine. The biggest challenge of this project was of course the first part, which was breaking down the cellulose. To do this, there were two main ways, either chemically or enzymatically, and both of them had their own pros and cons. The chemical method was more efficient, but it involved using a lot of acid, which would be hard to separate from the sugar after it was done. I would have most likely ended up having to neutralize all the acid, and I figured that this would both be wasteful and kind of messy. The enzyme method, on the other hand, appeared to be less efficient and even take longer, but from what I could tell, it was a lot cleaner and much easier to set up. After thinking about it for a good while, I felt that I liked the enzymatic way better, so the next thing that I had to do was buy some enzyme. The enzyme that I needed to break down the cellulose was called cellulase, and the cheapest source of it that I could find was from a company called the Alchemist's Pantry. They were a brewing company, and it was all supposed to be food-grade stuff, so it was almost perfect, and I bought a bag of it. It also clearly stated that all the cellulase came from yeast and not bacteria, and I'll explain why this was important later on. But anyway, the enzyme was being shipped from Europe, and it was going to take a few weeks to arrive. So, while I was waiting for it, I figured that it was a good time to actually put together the process that I was going to be doing. It honestly took me a while to figure it all out, but after a bunch of research, I eventually came up with something that was relatively simple. To do it, all I needed was some basic equipment and a few easy to get chemicals. When the enzyme eventually arrived, I considered doing some small scale tests to verify that what I came up with worked, but it was such a simple process that I decided to just wing it and go all in. If it ended up working, it would save me a lot of time, and I figured that at worst, I'd have a bunch of sad failure footage that could be used for something. So now, to get started, the first thing that I needed was some toilet paper.
Cute cats.
I'm pretty sure that almost any brand would have worked, but I specifically went with the one with the fluffy kittens on it. Toilet paper is one of the least densely packed forms of paper, which means that it has a lot of potential surface area for enzymes to attack it. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's easier for enzymes to break it down. At the molecular level, the cellulose fibers are still tightly packed together, and it's hard for cellulase to do anything. If I just directly mixed the enzyme with the toilet paper, not very much would happen, and it would probably make little to no sugar. To fix this problem though, it wasn't very hard, and I just had to pre-treat the cellulose with a dilute base. So, I got out a large pot, and into it, I added 3 liters of distilled water, followed by 60 grams of sodium hydroxide drain cleaner. This would give me roughly a 2% base solution, and I stirred it until everything dissolved. Then, I slowly added 1 entire roll, and as you would expect with toilet paper, it quickly started soaking it up. After about 10 seconds, it was completely full of water, and I tried to break it up as much as I could. I also pulled out the cardboard tube from the center, because I wanted to keep this purely just toilet paper.
ASMR.
I was eventually left with a nice and mushy toilet paper stew, and the next thing to do was to basically cook it. To do this, I just put it onto a cheap IKEA induction heater, and I cranked up the power. It all slowly heated up, and when it eventually got to a boil, I turned down the power to keep it at a light simmer. I tried stirring it often to prevent it from splashing, but it didn't really seem to help. It apparently just loves splattering boiling hot water everywhere, and I found that putting on the lid was absolutely necessary. The goal here was to try to keep it under control and to have it simmer for about an hour and a half. Under these conditions, the cellulose fibers were being attacked by the base and getting partially degraded. This caused a lot of the bonds between the fibers to be broken, which allowed them to separate and become less densely packed. It was also chopping up the cellulose fibers into smaller pieces, and their average length was going down a lot. This created more shorter length fibers, and this was important because it meant that there were more open ends. The cellulase enzyme can only degrade the fiber from the end, and by making more potential areas of attack, it should make it go a lot faster. In summary though, the major effect of this base treatment was that it was separating the fibers and chopping them up. By the time it was done, the whole thing had turned yellow, and it had a very distinct smell to it. I honestly thought that it was going to be horrible, but it was surprisingly pleasant. I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, but it was kind of sweet and woody. I took it off the heater and I let it cool for about 30 minutes, and when it wasn't crazy hot anymore, I filtered off all the paper. What I was left with in the strainer looked a lot like some bad mashed potatoes. In the container below it was all the water, and without the paper, it had a much darker orange-brown color. What I had to do now was wash it with a lot of distilled water to get rid of the base and as much of the color as possible. I tried doing this a couple times directly in the strainer, but it just wasn't very efficient, and most of the paper barely got washed. So what I did instead was clean the pot from before and dump everything back into it. In here, I was able to add a lot more water, and I was able to thoroughly mix around the paper to make sure that it all got washed. This was then poured back into the strainer, and after doing it just once, it was already looking pretty good. I ended up doing this one more time, and then I just did several crappier washes directly in the strainer. When I eventually felt that it was good enough, I tried squeezing out as much of the water as I could. At this point though, the container was quite full with water already, and it was hitting the bottom of the strainer. So, I just continued doing it over the pot, and this was what I was eventually left with. This pre-treated paper was now good to go, but I wasn't quite ready to get things started, and I still had to make the enzyme solution. To do this, I first had to make an enzyme concentrate by adding 90 grams of the enzyme powder that I got earlier, and then bringing it up to about 400 mils using distilled water. I then stirred it around, but a lot of it didn't want to dissolve because most of this enzyme powder was just filler. It's pretty common for enzymes to be dispersed on inert fillers, and in this case, the fillers were cornstarch and maltodextrin. The cellulase enzyme itself and most of the maltodextrin dissolved into the water, but the cornstarch was pretty much insoluble. When I was planning this project, I was a bit concerned because both cornstarch and maltodextrin are also glucose-based sugars. I was worried that they might also end up getting broken down into glucose and turned into ethanol, but this actually isn't an issue. They don't get attacked by the cellulase, and the yeast in the fermentation step that I'll be doing later aren't able to break them down either. I even confirmed this by doing a separate control run, but I'll talk about that later in the video. Because these fillers were inert, I could have just directly used this mixture as it was, but I wanted to clean it up a bit and to get rid of the cornstarch. Filtering cornstarch though is almost always a nightmare, and instead, I just covered the top and I let it sit in my fridge overnight. By the next morning, it had pretty much all separated, and this enzyme concentrate was now good to go. To make the actual enzyme solution though, I had to dilute this concentrate in something known as a buffer solution. A buffer solution is something that's commonly used when working with enzymes, and it helps keep the pH at a specific level. This is important because enzymes are very sensitive to pH, and they work most efficiently in a certain range. The cellulase that I had was from yeast, and the optimal pH for it was 5, so that was what I had to make the buffer at. There are many different chemicals that can be used to make a buffer, but a very easy and common method is to use citric acid and sodium citrate. Both of these are common food additives, and I was able to easily find them at a local store. I also found a calculator for making this buffer online, and all I had to do was plug in the pH that I wanted, the concentration, and the total volume that I was going for. Based on my research, a total of 3 liters seemed ideal, with a pH of 5 and a molarity of 0.05. After plugging this in, it told me to use about 25 grams of the sodium citrate and 12.2 grams of the citric acid. So, into a large mason jar, I added 2.6 liters of distilled water, followed by the citric acid and the sodium citrate. I stirred it around until it all dissolved.
I don't know what the, like, is there really a difference between water, like distilled water, and some, you know, I don't, wait, who's that? Someone is in the chat. Someone's watching. Well, okay, let's check the chat. Hold on, there's... Where was it? Let's see. Someone is in the chat. No. What? Oh. Someone is in the chat. Ew, what is that? By Mythical Ijaklaha. Oh, well, alright. Okay. Someone just commented at the 4-minute mark. Ew, what is that? Which is not really, you know, I don't know. Anyways. Well, where should I? Here? Maybe here. I'm gonna put this there. Are you still watching, Miss or Mr. Mythical Ijaklaha? I don't know who this person is. It's just this person that's watching. You know. Oh hi! Oh hi! Hello! Hi, Zorbs. How you doing? I'm just here. Someone's in the first time chat. Hey, I'm getting chats. Okay. Where are you located? I'm good. Okay, what about you? I'm good actually. I'm pretty good. Where are you located? Singapore. Someone's from Singapore here? Okay. No, I'm not based out of Singapore. I'm from the Philippines. Fancy Fanta 1 thinks I'm from Singapore. Before show. Figgy Welsh Jr. was the one who asked. Wow, I have viewers now. I have viewers. So that's pretty nice. That's pretty good. Yeah, it's very surprising that at this point I'm now getting, you know, chats like this. What's that? Oh, no. Yo, who's that in the back? She bad for it. Do you have chickens in your house? Yes. They're outside. Who's it? No one's. But I don't think you should. Wait, these people are subscribed to Pine Gaming. What the hell? Are you gonna play a game? Maybe later. You know, I'm still about an hour into the stream. But for now, I'm still actually just going to watch a video. You can leave if you want. Oh, thank you for the follow. Hey, this is now a golden period of my streaming career because there's a real people watching. Yeah. Thanks for the follows, by the way. They're not just here. Yeah. Let's watch. Let's watch. Okay.
And into this, I poured the enzyme concentrate from before, which brought it up to 3 liters.
By the way, I got distracted by the chats. I like paused at this point because I was like, is there a difference between distilled water and any kind of water? You know, is there any difference? I don't know. Different video. I've bored. Someone's. Oh, come on. Figo Wells Jr. said I'm handsome. I mean, thanks, but you know. Okay. I don't know. I don't know what to say. But yeah. Are you smart? I actually don't know. Maybe? Oh no, oh no, 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 no. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. Wait, how do I exit? Type no. There we go, chat. Oh, come on. What the hell? I think it's just stuck to it. Did your Google crash? No, go to your Twitter. I don't know. How old are you? I actually do not want to answer that. I'm a bit old, you know, I'll be honest. Shut that chicken up. I mean, I really can't. Kill the chicken in the back of saying. You can leave. You can leave the stream. You can get some kids. I mean, good for you, I guess. Because, but me, I'm not going to. Okay. You do you, chat. You do you. You do you, chat. Okay, you do you. Just gonna do my own thing here and just watch because, you know.
I tried to leave as much of the cornstarch as I could in the beaker, but some of it was still able to make it in. Now after all this, the enzyme solution was finally ready, and all I had to do was add the toilet paper. When it was all in there, I mixed it around as thoroughly as I could, and I loosely covered the top. I then took this whole thing and I put it into an oven that was set just slightly above 50°C. This was the optimal temperature that this cellulase worked at, and I had to leave it in there for 2 days. Over this time, the enzyme should be attacking the cellulose and slowly turning it into glucose. When it comes to cellulase though, it usually isn't just one enzyme doing everything, and it's actually a group of a few different ones, all working together. The first one is endocellulose.
Watch a documentary about the Philippines. If you ban me 1/3 of your base. I didn't ban anyone, I actually just accidentally banned someone. I mean, I wasn't focused on the video. Oh no, I'm actually just looking at the chat. Um, if you ban me, a third of your fan base is gone. I actually didn't ask for this whatsoever. No, no, I'm not gonna do that. You're all freaks, by the way. I did not ask for this whatsoever. I really, no.
Relays, and it breaks the bonds between the.
By the way, I'm not watching this as a tutorial. I'm not going to make this later. No, I'm not going. No, I'm not saying all of you are freaks. Just some of you are. I don't think Figo Wells Jr. is a freak. You know. Oh, come on. Yeah. Which one of us are freaks? I am not saying anything. Just some, not all. No, please don't. No, absolutely not. I don't want any of you to be freaks. I wish all of you weren't. Yeah. Oh, please don't. You look good with long hair. No, I don't want to have long hair. Like whatsoever. I don't want long hair whatsoever. My friend. Okay, so I think we have answered who the freak is. What? No. Oh, come on. The chat's now getting offensive.
Fibers and within the fibers themselves. By pre-treating the paper with a base though, a lot of these bonds were already broken and the ones that remained were a lot easier to access. The liberated fibers were then attacked by the exoskeleton.
Cock me. Oh, what does cock mean? Oh, come on, man. Figo Wells Jr. is an innocent bud. Go. Well, cock means I don't know. Was it like? Correct me if I'm wrong, but is it like cock means being like letting your wife be unfaithful to you or something? I don't know. Come on, have some respect on Figo Wells Jr. That's unacceptable here. Do you like to watch, bro? I don't know.
Cellulase, which degrades them from their ends. So what it does is bind to the end and travel along the fiber and chop off groups of 2 or 4 glucose units. These much smaller sugar units are then finally broken down into glucose by another enzyme called cellobiase. When I checked on it the next day, the paper had all floated to the top. I then stirred it, and compared to before, it was definitely a lot thinner and fluffier. The cellulase had clearly done something to it, and so far, it was looking a lot better than I expected.
Family. They are... Show us your parents. No. Ed. They're actually currently not here right now, and if they were, I'm not going to show you to them at all. Yummy pea. No. Where's my family? They're in a mall shopping. Sister reveal. No. Yes, I do have a dog. I am tempted to bad fancy Fanta and Sorbs. I'm just tempted because of how offensive they're getting. No, that wasn't my sister. She kind of bad. Please don't. Does your sister have Instagram? No. Like I said, I'm not. Oh, come on, man.
I checked on it again about half an hour later, and it had separated, where most of it stayed floating. The stuff at the top was slowly falling down though, and over the course of the day, most of it ended up at the bottom. I left it until the next day, until it hit the 48-hour mark, and this was what I had. There was still a bunch of stuff left over, but it didn't at all resemble the toilet paper that I started with. It was done at this point, so I took it out of the oven, but before moving on, I had to let it cool down. It was currently somewhere just above 50°C, but I needed it to be closer to 35. This was going to take about an hour though.
Figgy, I bet you nice. My parents make 20 mil a year. Your house looks nice. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it kind of looks nice. Figgy is Somalian living in the Philippines. Do you accept him? Yeah, I'm not evil. You speak Tagalog. I can, I just don't. Your family makes 20 million rupees a year. Well, good for them. Isn't it like 20 million rupees? I don't know what the conversion rate is between rupees and US dollars. Is it your maid? I don't know. Can you let me sleep in your home? My parents left me. Oh, that's sad. Can share the dog bed. You shouldn't. To be honest, there's too many people. This house is actually like packed full of people, but they're currently just not here right now. So, Fancy Fanta 1 also asked, "Can I speak? Do you speak Tagalog?" Yes, I can. I just don't. Fanta, you can live with me in my hut. You must share a bed with your sis. Promise I won't eat the dog if I get hungry. I didn't say you shouldn't, but I do not. Absolutely not. If you're in India. Oh, Figo Welsh has a hut. I wanna live in your African hut. So this is where we're getting racist now, huh? Made of clay and eat fufu. I think fufu tastes delicious. I haven't tasted it. Bangladesh wanna smoke some dubious doobies. Bangladesh. Huh. Go talk on your own, chat. Please don't get me involved.
And in the meantime, I poked around at it a bit. I was honestly really impressed with how fine and fluffy it was, and like I said before, I really didn't expect it to work this well. I'm really not sure exactly how much paper was still left here, but I feel like it was probably around 10 to 20% of what I started with. However, that's almost just entirely speculation on my part, and not really based.
Why is Figo Welsh Jr. now apologizing? I've been living off eating elephant poop and mud soup. With elephant poop. Okay, I think this is misinformation now. I don't know. I'm tempted to not believe him because Fancy Fanta 1 has Prime Gaming. So I don't think that's true.
On much. When it eventually got to 35°C, it was time to add the yeast. When it comes to fermenting sugar to make alcohol, there are a lot of different yeast strains to choose from, and each of them have their own pros and cons. However, in my case, I wasn't doing anything very fancy, so I just went with common brewer's yeast, which can tolerate many conditions. These conditions though, at least in terms of pH, were actually kind of ideal. As I mentioned earlier, the cellulase that I was using originally came from yeast, so the pH was already tuned to be optimal for yeast. This was why I didn't want to use a bacterial cellulase, because then I would have had to readjust the pH. The yeast in the packet was dehydrated, and right now, they were all getting rehydrated and coming back to life. I then snapped on the plastic adapter that the jar came with, followed by the lid that I had modified. I had cut a hole.
Batty, I see your mom smash so cute. You're all thirsty. Oh, like, no. What's her hat? No. Charger phone. I actually... You know what? I'm going to... I go to the market, I was telling you about it. Bring your mom, they can. No. Tell your mom I said hi. No. You know what? I can't stand this. This is unacceptable behavior. There we go. Figo Welsh Jr., you're the only one remaining because you're the most rational, okay? I know. Way too mean. I had to ban them. I had to. It was getting unacceptable. Well, there you go, Figo Welsh. You're safe now. It's now banned. Yep, I will not unban them anytime soon. Because I don't want them to... They will be really racist. Yeah. I just slid it down a bit and then it was like... Okay. Chop chop movie boy. Oh, come on. Really? You wanna get banned too? Alright.
Hole in it to fit a stopper and an airlock so that it could prevent air from getting in and to also help track the progress of the fermentation. Initially, not much appeared to be happening, but then, very quickly, a lot of yeast flakes started floating to the top. They were being carried by the CO2 gas that they were producing, which gave them some buoyancy. When they got to the top though and released the CO2, they would then sink back down. This cycle continued for a while, but it didn't last forever because the yeast were slowly being dispersed into the water. By the next day, it was just a murky looking mixture and there were no pieces floating around anymore. It was also generating a lot of CO2,
I think I might be
which was a very good
oh,
sign.
No. Come on. Now that the one guy said I was. Do you not realize that that was an insult to provoke you? That was... Oh, come on, man. Don't get that in your head. No, don't think that. You're a really nice guy. No, don't listen to them. They were just really trying to get a reaction out of you. And I don't think they achieved it, but they tried. So next time someone says you're a cunt or any insult, just don't get it into your head because, you know, your English is really good. How long have you been speaking? I don't know. I'm still young. About maybe a decade. I don't know. Since I learned how to read, I spoke English. Yeah. I'm 16, by the way, so just get that out. Yeah. So many people, even fellow Filipinos themselves, say that I speak really good English. Your English isn't very good. Well, it doesn't have to be. As long as you're fluent in it, you don't have to have a general American accent. Because, you know, it doesn't really matter if your English is good or not. Look at me. I always speak very very good English, but it's does like my life is still like this. I live in a country where speaking English matters, but the accent doesn't. So it kind of weighs out. Where do you live, by the way? Because your username is Figgy Welsh or Figgle. It's Figgle. Oh right, it's Figgle Welsh Jr. Oh. Oh well, right. Yeah. Anyways. Why do you have Prime Gaming on, by the way? You have disposable income.
Because it told me that the yeast were happily eating away at sugar. How much sugar was actually there though, I had no idea, but it was definitely working, at least to some degree. I then looked at the airlock, and it was letting a bubble out about every 30 seconds, which was a pretty decent rate. What I had to do now was basically nothing, and I just had to wait until it completely stopped bubbling. When this eventually happens, it would mean that there was little to no sugar left, and I figured it would take about 2 weeks. I didn't just leave it where it was though, and I put it in the oven that I used before, and I kept it just above 30°C. This was about a week later, and the amount of paper at the bottom had gone down quite a bit. This was because I had never deactivated the cellulase, and it was still slowly attacking the cellulose. It wasn't as efficient because it was around 30°C instead of above 50, but it was still apparently working. In terms of bubbling, it was much slower than before, but it was still clearly going on, so I put it back in the oven and I waited another week. So I came back a week later, and when I checked on it, the airlock wasn't moving at all, and I couldn't see any bubbling going on. At the bottom, there was still some white stuff, but I wasn't sure if this was leftover paper or just a bunch of yeast. At this point, I considered it done, and now, the next thing that I had to do was distill it to get out the ethanol. I didn't want to include all that questionable stuff at the bottom though, so I poured everything into another container. The bit that was still there was then dumped into a coffee filter. This filtration was really slow, and it wasn't really worth waiting for it to finish. The liquid that did eventually pass through though would all be added back to the main batch. But anyway, with all that done, I could start setting up the distillation. When most people distill alcohol, they use a large and specialized setup for it, which is the most efficient thing to do. However, I just decided to do it in glassware because my scale was relatively small and I thought that it would look nicer. Almost all my glassware had been used before, so to keep this food safe, I bought a fresh set from eBay for about $55 Canadian. The biggest flask that it came with though was only 1 liter, so I'd have to distill it in multiple batches. To get things started, I added a stir bar, and then I poured in the alcohol solution. In general, it's best not to go much over the halfway point, but I wanted to get this done in the fewest batches possible, so I ended up pushing it a bit. Above the flask, I put together the rest of the setup, and to do this, I used a fractional column, a thermometer, a condenser, and a beaker. I then turned on my water circulator, and I got some cold water flowing through the condenser. At this point, it was good to go, so under the flask I added a heating mantle, and I turned on the heating and stirring. As it warmed up, it started bubbling a lot, but it wasn't boiling, and it was mostly just CO2 gas getting kicked out of solution. The color also shifted to being much whiter, and I think this was caused by yeast coming out of suspension. Some frothing started happening, and it didn't look like it wanted to disappear, and this was going to be a problem. So I turned on the heating to try to prevent a disaster, but it was a bit too late. The foam had already started climbing the column, and it wasn't really slowing down. It was able to make its way all the way to the top of the column, and then suddenly, it started actually boiling and it launched a bunch of liquid through the entire setup. This was a bit of a pain, but it wasn't the end of the world. It just meant that it was going to take a bit longer because I now had to recycle everything here in the next batch, and also I had to be a bit more careful with the heating. When it eventually looked like it was under control, I covered the flask and the column with some aluminum foil. This helps insulate them, and it makes it easier for the vapor to climb the column and make it to the condenser. I also swapped the beaker, but the stuff coming over was still pretty murky because it was picking up all the solid junk that was carried up the column before. This run was definitely turning out to be way messier than I expected. I was hoping that this stuff would be nice and clear, but that obviously wasn't the case, and I was gonna have to recycle this as well. It wasn't a total loss or anything though, because the alcohol coming over was definitely a lot more concentrated than it started at. It just didn't look very nice. However, it was still mostly just water, and it had other volatile stuff mixed in as well. To really clean it up and to properly concentrate it, I'd have to do a second or maybe even a third distillation. The reason that the stuff coming over was mostly water was because I was only starting with a very low concentration of ethanol. In my fermentation mixture, it was probably at most something like 2% ethanol, and that meant that it was 98% water. At the very beginning, the stuff coming over was probably close to 50 or 60% ethanol, but after that, it quickly and continuously dropped. This happened because as the ethanol was boiled off, that 2% concentration was constantly decreasing and the relative amount of water was constantly increasing. This caused more and more water vapor to be let off with the ethanol, and the stuff that I was receiving eventually became almost entirely water. This meant that I couldn't really trust the thermometer because the temperature was heavily skewed to the boiling point of water. However, even though it was well above the boiling point of ethanol, which is around 78°C, there was still some ethanol coming over once it was up at around 98. Usually, temperature is the best thing to go by, but because I couldn't use it here, I had to go with the more traditional way. So, to know how close it was to being done, I just occasionally tasted what was coming over and tried to tell if there was any ethanol in it. As I said before though, along with the water and ethanol, there's other volatile stuff coming over with it, which doesn't really make it taste very good. It wasn't as bad as I expected it would be, but I did end up spitting out most of what I tried. At some point, I couldn't taste any more ethanol in it, and then I continued collecting it for several more minutes. After this, I considered it done, and pretty much all of the ethanol should have been extracted. Everything left in the boiling flask was just waste, and after letting it cool for a bit, I poured it down the drain. This was one of the rare times where it's okay for me to do this, because unlike a lot of the chemistry that I often do, there was nothing toxic or dangerous in this. This was everything that I'd collected, which was not very pretty to say the least, and like I said before, was just going to be recycled. So, I reattached the now empty flask, and I poured them in. I then added more of the other stuff, and I set it all up again. This time, I was super careful with the heating, and there wasn't a disaster. This time...
Hold on, let me clarify. I just want to clarify something. Let's see. Oh no, it doesn't. There you go. It actually says 4:13 p.m., not the 4:13 mark on the, Okay. So it actually doesn't say which mark of the live stream. It actually says what time. So when Mythical Jaklaha said, "Ew, what is that?" What it meant was he or she, that person, said that at 4:13 p.m., not at the 4-minute 13-second mark where I was like yapping here and talking about and playing spell check. There we go. So
Because it was going to be a lot slower, I expected the ethanol coming over to be just going to be recycled. So, I reattached the now empty flask, and I poured them in. I then added more of the other stuff, and I set it all up again. This time, I was super careful with the heating, and there wasn't a disaster. This time, because it was going to be a lot slower, I expected the ethanol coming over to be more concentrated, and I started with just a small vial. However, after a bit, I realized that I was going to be collecting a lot more than this, and I swapped it out for a mason jar. Then, just like the other run, I did it until a taste test told me that there wasn't any more alcohol coming over. And when it was done, I emptied the flask, filled it with fresh stuff, and just kept it going. It was all going really well all the way up to the last batch, and everything that I had was nice and clear. However, for some reason, it of course decided to go crazy right when I was close to the end, and it spit over a bunch of that white junk. This wasn't a huge deal though, because I planned to do a second distillation anyway, but it was still kind of sad. This whole distillation process was way slower than I expected, and it took me a few days to finish. At this point though, it was finally done, so I took away the mason jar and I dumped out all the stuff in the flask. What I had now was less than 10% of the volume that I started with, so it was way more concentrated than before. As a quick test, mostly just for fun, I decided to try lighting it on fire. However, it still wasn't concentrated enough to ignite, and not very much happened. I honestly wasn't very surprised by this though, and now, to actually find out its concentration, I poured it all into a grad cylinder. I then dropped in a hydrometer, which will float at different heights depending on the density of the liquid. When there's more ethanol, the density will be lower, and this meter will be able to sink deeper. In this case though, it didn't go very deep at all, and it told me that the concentration was around 20%. This was way higher than I ever imagined getting from this project, and 250 mils of 20% alcohol really isn't bad at all. I was hoping to maybe get 5 or 10 mils of pure alcohol, but based on this, it's telling me that there's more like 50. But anyway, at this point, if all I was looking for was to drink some dirty toilet paper wine, I could have stopped here. However, based on the taste test that I had to do, this wouldn't be a very pleasant experience. To make it even remotely tolerable, I had to distill it again to get rid of all that solid junk and to purify it. Besides ethanol, there were a lot of other volatile and bad tasting things in there. When it was super dilute, it was very difficult to get rid of them, but now with another distillation, I should be able to get rid of almost all of them. This time I had a lot less liquid, so I could do it in a smaller flask and all in one batch. I also completely cleaned and scrubbed the rest of the setup to make sure that it was as clean as possible. I then set it up like before, but this time, the heating mantle was a bit oversized. This was okay though, and it would just make the heating a bit less efficient. However, with most of the yeast and most of the other stuff gone now, there shouldn't be a problem with bubbling or foaming. At this point, I was just about to get things started, but then I realized that I totally forgot the stir bar. So, I just quickly popped it open again and dropped one in, and then I turned on the heating and stirring. After this, I covered everything with foil, and I waited for stuff to start coming over. One major difference between this distillation and the last one was that there was way less water, so I could actually pay attention to the temperature. The first drop showed up at around 70 C, and then it slowly rose to 79 C, where it remained constant. This initial amount was called the foreshot, and it contained almost entirely low boiling point side products. In this section, if it were present, most of the methanol would come over, but I don't think that there was any here. This is because methanol is only produced when certain foods are fermented that contain sugars called pectins. I started with nearly pure cellulose though, so there was no real reason for any of it to be made. As I kept collecting it at 79C, it slowly got into the portion called the heads, which was mostly ethanol, but it still had some other stuff in it. I kept catching it in the same vial as the foreshot for a bit, and then I swapped it to a beaker to get the rest. As more came over, it slowly moved to the section called the hearts, which was almost pure ethanol. Along with the ethanol though, usually comes some other things which actually taste good, and it makes this portion the most valuable. I was tracking everything, again by occasionally tasting it, and at this point, it was quite pure and probably around 85%. Like before though, there was still a lot of water in the boiling flask, and the amount of ethanol that was in it was constantly decreasing. So the stuff that I was collecting slowly got less concentrated, and the temperature also slowly increased. As this happened, higher boiling point side products were being carried over with the ethanol, and it was changing the taste. This portion is near the end of the distillation, and it's commonly known as the tails. However, I didn't ferment anything complex like fruit, so for this section, there weren't many side products that could come over. To me, the only thing that I noticed was that it was getting more dilute, and maybe a bit bitter. When making moonshine, distillers usually don't collect everything in one container, and they try to separate the different sections. Both the heads and the tails contain a lot of ethanol, but they often have a bunch of weird stuff mixed in, so they're often just included in future runs. The hearts, like I said before, are the most valuable, and they contain the best tasting portion. Knowing exactly when to start collecting the hearts and when to stop is one of the most important things when it comes to making a good quality product. I, of course, wasn't making a typical moonshine though, and I felt that my ethanol was a bit too precious to discard any of it. This was why I just chose to collect everything in one beaker. Also, like I said before, I was starting with a relatively pure sugar source, so there weren't that many side products that could be made. When it got to around 80 mils, the temperature was about 99°C, and I didn't taste ethanol anymore, so I considered it done. This was everything that was left in the boiling flask, and like all the other runs, I waited for it to cool, and then I got rid of it. The final result of this was 80 mils of an unknown concentration and this little vial of the 4-shot. I'm not sure how to describe it, but the 4-shot really didn't smell very good, and I just threw it away. Now for the good part, I wanted to know how concentrated it was. Instead of just doing it with a hydrometer though, I again tried lighting it on fire. This time it ignited really easily, and it burned with that blue flame that's typical of ethanol. I was really happy that this worked, but it didn't really tell me much of anything about what the concentration actually was. To get an accurate number, again, I just had to use a hydrometer. The volume here was really low though, and my current setup couldn't do it, so I had to buy a smaller one. However, at first, this one also looked like it was still too big. When I looked at the bottom of it much closer though, I saw that it was actually floating. So, the reading on here should be fine, and it told me that it was about 64%. This was more or less what I was expecting to get, and I felt that 64% was decent for a moonshine, and I didn't have to distill it again. So at this point, it was pretty much done, and I poured it all into a little jar, and I labeled it appropriately. At 64% and about 78 mils, this was equivalent to 50 mils of pure ethanol, and like I said before, it was way more than I ever expected. I started with 100 grams of toilet paper, and assuming that 100% of that mass was turned into glucose, the maximum yield was about 60 mils. This meant that this whole process was 83% efficient, which to me was suspiciously good. This got me worried that maybe the maltodextrin or the cornstarch that was added along with the enzyme was breaking down as well. Theoretically, cellulase doesn't attack either of these sugars and yeast can't ferment them, but I had to make sure. So I ran a control by repeating the exact same process, and I just didn't include any toilet paper. When I distilled it all, I did actually get some ethanol, and my final yield was 20 mils of 20%. This meant that there were 5 mils of pure ethanol, and this likely came from the maltodextrin, which can sometimes have a small amount of fermentable sugar in it. So, it was contributing some ethanol, but pretty much all of it was still from the toilet paper. If 5 mils were coming from the enzyme though, then my real yield was 45 mils and not 50, and my actual efficiency was about 75%. In my opinion, this was still shockingly good, and even though I did everything myself, it's still kind of hard to believe that it all came from toilet paper. But anyway, now that I had actually made it, the only thing left to do was to see how it tasted. While I was distilling it, I individually tasted each section, but now that it was all combined into one, I was really curious to know what it was like.
Okay, so to get started, I'm just gonna smell it. And I mean, there's nothing gross about it, but also nothing really very special. It kind of smells like vodka, except with a bit of extra, maybe not good other stuff in there, which again, as I mentioned before, probably comes from either the heads or the tails, but it's not bad overall. And I guess I'll just taste it now. I mean, it's really strong because it's 64%, but it doesn't taste very bad. It's a little bit bitter, which I kind of got when I was tasting the tails when I was making it. Other than that, I don't know. I'm honestly not the best person to really review it because I don't drink alcohol often, and I honestly don't really like the taste of alcohol. But compared to vodkas and other stuff I've had in the past, this wasn't that much worse. There was, again, that little bit of a bitter taste, and maybe some off taste that came from the heads, but besides that, I mean, it wasn't too bad. If I were just served it, I would think that it's just generic alcohol, which I hate anyway. I'm not gonna add that part.
But anyway, this about brings me to the end of this project. When I first came up with the idea for this, it was mostly just a funny concept, and I had no idea that it was actually going to work this well. I was honestly hoping for maybe 5 mils, and it's probably the first time ever that a project has turned out this much better than I expected. Also, even though I'm really not a fan of alcohol, the flavor wasn't bad, and overall, I'm still shocked at how well it all turned out. For all the alcohol that I still have left over, I would have loved to do a giveaway, but I doubt that it would be legal. So, I'm just going to be keeping it as a souvenir, and maybe I'll try to use it in a future video. It took me a lot longer than I expected to put this all together, so my video schedule is a bit weird now, but I do plan to get another one out around mid-December. I don't want to give any details of what it's going to be about, but this next one is also a funny concept that I'd been working on for a while. It's also kind of food-based too, so there will be some more tasting going on. Before I go though, I want to quickly mention Team Trees, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have already heard about at this point. For those that haven't though, it's a tree planting initiative that was started by Mr. Beast and Mark Rober. It's a massive YouTube collaboration, and every dollar that's donated will plant 1 tree somewhere around the world, and the goal is to get to 20 million. At the time of editing this, they're less than 5 million away, and if you want to help, you can do this by either donating or picking up some of their merch. And just as one last thing, I don't mention my other social media here very often, but I am also on Twitter and Instagram. On both of these, I often post content that never makes it to YouTube, and sometimes I also share some high quality stuff like this. As usual, a big thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon. Everyone who supports me can see my videos at least 24 hours before I post them to YouTube. Also, everyone on Patreon can directly message me, and if you support me with $5 or more, you'll get your...
Oh boy. Oh boy. Anyways, that concludes this live stream. Yeah, 103 minutes of just me doing whatever this is. I'm gonna turn this into 104 minutes, so an hour 44 minutes of me, I don't know. Oh boy. I know I'm just sitting here doing nothing, but it is kind of tiring. Yeah.